Moving even further to the right, Mitt Romney announces his running mate for the Republican presidential ticket. We examine Congressman Paul Ryan's background and what Romney's pick means for Americans should he be elected. You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. U.S. Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney has struggled to solidify support from the most conservative wing of the Republican Party. And it's for that reason, many analysts say, he chose Paul Ryan to be his running mate. The 42-year-old congressman from Wisconsin is a staunch conservative, both fiscally and socially. Ryan believes in giving fertilized embryos full rights, essentially equating abortion with murder. And he's a climate change skeptic. But when Mitt Romney refers to him as the intellectual leader of the Republican Party, he's most likely referring to his reputation as a deficit hawk. In 2011, he proposed a budget plan that would reduce government spending by more than $5 trillion over 10 years. According to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, most of those cuts would come from programs that help the country's poorest. So how has Romney's pick been received by both Republicans and Democrats? Kimberly Halkett finds out from the battleground state of Iowa.
The addition of Paul Ryan to the Republican ticket is getting mixed reactions depending on who you talk to. Now, Republicans really like Paul Ryan. They say he is the person who can turn around the struggling U.S. economy because it is money issues that will be key to winning in November. They say they like his anti-abortion stance and will unite both social and fiscal conservatives within the Republican Party. They also like his experience. They say the fact that he was elected to the U.S. Congress when he was just 28 years old and has served 7 terms makes him very valuable when it comes to decision making. That's what Democrats don't like about Paul Ryan. They say that, in fact, he is a Washington insider who is out of touch with ordinary Americans. They also say that his anti-abortion stance, under any circumstances, is just simply too radical and makes him too radical for the job of leading the United States. And finally, they also say that he's the face of a very unpopular budget, a budget that would plan to slash many programs, social programs that are critical to millions of Americans like Medicare and Social Security. Now, when it comes to independents, they have a mostly favorable view of Paul Ryan. In fact, new poll numbers show that 45% of independents actually prefer Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. That's compared to just 40% of independents who prefer President Obama and the current Vice President, Joe Biden.
So, who is Paul Ryan and why did Romney choose him as his running mate? Joining us to discuss this, Wendell Potter, senior analyst at the Center for Public Integrity. He's also a former executive turned critic of the U.S. medical insurance industry. Joining us from New York, John Nichols, political writer for The Nation magazine. And here in the studio, Bruce Fein, former senior policy advisor to the Ron Paul 2012 presidential campaign. John Nichols, from what we know, how did Romney come to this decision? Wasn't he supposed to be moderating some of the more extreme positions that we heard on the primary campaign trail so as not to spook independents?
That's how it's supposed to work, but Mitt Romney developed a problem in the summer of 2012 at a point when he should have been taking the fight to Barack Obama. He ended up having to put out fires within his own party. Just in the last week or so, he had a huge controversy over one of his aides suggesting that people without health care, if they lived in Massachusetts, would have had Romney care. That made a lot of conservatives very unhappy. He also appointed Robert Zoellick, who's a head of the World Bank, former U.S. trade representative, close ally of James Baker in the first Bush administration, as the head of his transition team on foreign policy. That made a lot of the neoconservatives very unhappy. And so you start to hear this cry from the right of the party saying, look, we need a different kind of vice presidential candidate. We want somebody we can absolutely rely on. And so we want Paul Ryan. The Wall Street Journal editorialized for Paul Ryan. The Weekly Standard, both very conservative publications, advertised for Paul, or editorialized for Paul Ryan. Newt Gingrich said that he'd be the right choice, even though he had once been very condemnatory of Ryan. And so there became a drumbeat within the party. I think Romney had leaned toward Ryan anyway, and this closed the deal.
Bruce Fein, does this calm the Republican base? Does it allay the suspicions that Romney isn't necessarily one of them?
No, in fact, it might produce the opposite effect, because it looks as though, since Romney is not Paul Ryan, he needs somebody to give that optic out there, even though historically vice presidents generally visit victims of earthquakes and attend funerals and do little or nothing else. If you ask, for instance, what have been the major impact on policy of Joe Biden in the Obama administration, you'd probably need to spend more than a few weeks coming up with anything. And so Romney himself is going to be the one who will be making those decisions in the Oval Office, and the fact that Mr. Ryan may have an office in the West Wing is going to have no impact on the actual policies whatsoever. And I think once people are able to digest that this is just the vice presidential nominee, which one time was described as not worth a bucket of warm spit, that glitter from the Tea Party side will start to dwindle very quickly.
But hasn't he proven to be surprisingly influential, Wendell Potter, because he has been sort of defining the framework in which some of the discussion about the deficit is discussed, even amongst Democrats in the White House?
Oh, absolutely. Because of his position as committee chairman, he's been able to do that. He certainly has been around for a long time and has been someone who wanted to make sure that his voice was heard. So to that extent, he's become someone actually within his party and within even the Tea Party, someone who articulates a certain point of view that is.
But he has shifted the whole conversation, hasn't he? He's been quite successful.
Oh, absolutely, he has.
Well, he has and he hasn't, because remember, this is a gentleman who voted for TARP, which was amongst the Republicans sort of toxic. The
bank
example,
bailout.
yeah, the bank bailout, which was $180 billion to AIG, billions of dollars to banks that are foreclosing on people's properties and things of that sort. He voted for the bailout of Chrysler, the bailout of General Motors. So it's pretty hard.
Unfunded wars.
And so unfunded wars, and this is the voting to increase the national debt now that's at $16 trillion, and even his so-called austere Ryan budget doesn't produce a balanced budget until the year 2040.
Well, let's go through that.
28 years away.
I mean, this is the key. I mean, this is what catapulted him to fame or infamy, at least here in D.C. One wonders sometimes actually whether he's quite as well known out of D.C. But according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Ryan's proposed budget comes at a huge cost for the country's most vulnerable. It proposes $5.3 trillion in non-defense budget cuts over 10 years. At least 62%, $3.3 trillion, would come from programs that help Americans with low or moderate income. $2.4 trillion in reductions would come from Medicaid and other healthcare programs for people with limited means. There would be $134 billion cut from the U.S. food stamp program called SNAP. 8 to 10 million people would be thrown out of that program. Ryan's budget calls for another $1.2 trillion in cuts, but doesn't specify which other programs would be cut. So this is particularly interesting because this is what Ryan's reputation as the great intellectual and philosopher-in-chief of the Republican Party, for the Republican Party, comes from. Wendell Potter, you, however, have written that this isn't a path to prosperity, as it's been called, but a path to a poorhouse. What do you mean by that?
Well, he does espouse a small government, and I think that has been part of his appeal. But what he is proposing in particular would be to pretty much eviscerate the Medicare program. He's proposing to essentially privatize it, to hand it to the private insurance industry, the industry that I used to work for 20 years, and I know from having worked for those companies that that's the opposite direction we ought to be going. These companies have a long history of kicking people out of coverage and of reducing benefits and not being.
So what specifically will his plan mean for beneficiaries?
Well, what it would mean, those who are currently 55 or younger would be given a premium support or a voucher to buy coverage. They presumably would be able to choose to stay in the traditional Medicare program if they choose to do that, but Medicare would have to compete with any number of private insurance companies, and they would be given a set amount of money. and that premium support would be based on a certain amount of money, and it would increase over time to a certain extent, but not keeping up with medical inflation.
So pegged to the consumer price index as opposed to, I mean, how representative of medical costs is the consumer price index?
Not at all. The medical costs have been outstripping the consumer price index for quite a long time. In fact, in this past year, it's been about 2.5 times the consumer price index.
But how does he argue that this makes sense when he's challenged? I assume he will be challenged now. That people won't, it's not going to keep up with inflation.
They'll be using some terms like choice and competition. These are terms that I used to create when I was in the insurance industry to make people think that this is a good thing. Why wouldn't you think that having more choice would make sense? People buy that stuff. They buy that kind of spin, and that's why people vote against their own self-interest.
John Nichols, I mean, Medicare is hugely popular. So isn't this a possible liability for the Romney campaign now?
Possible. I would suggest that it is a gaping, huge liability. And it's one of the reasons why on Saturday morning, when Mitt Romney announced the selection of Paul Ryan, there were two loud cheers that could be heard across America. One of those loud cheers came from the ship where the Republicans gathered for the announcement. The other came from the Barack Obama re-election campaign headquarters, because there's simply no question that President Obama and the Democrats wanted Paul Ryan on the ticket. Now, I want to emphasize, I've known Paul Ryan for the better part of 15 years. I know him to be a very capable politician and a very capable communicator. He is not a pure liability to the Republican ticket. He will bring strengths and he will unite the base in some ways. But when you begin to look at his positions on issues such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, also on dramatic tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, and when you move off the budget issues into areas like social policy, his stances on reproductive rights, and foreign policy, his passionate advocacy for unfunded wars all over the world, as well as for Pentagon budgets that just blow the top off. This is a guy who I think an awfully lot of Americans will ultimately have a discomfort with.
Bruce Fein?
Yes. I agree with that, and I think it's incorrect to think that Mr. Ryan is in favor of a smaller government when his national security policy is one that projects military force everywhere in the world. And people forget, we have $1.2 trillion spent annually at present on national security issues, which would include Department of Energy housing the nuclear weapons. $1.2 trillion, and that under Romney and Ryan is supposed to get larger rather than smaller. And this is a sector of the economy that's the least competitive. We have Ryan and Romney saying, oh, we need to have competition, we need choice. These are sole source contacts, staggering sums of money.
Help us understand then, from the Republican Party perspective, if he has, his rhetoric is one thing, his actual plan is quite another, and actually it's filled with various generalities about how it is, revenue, it's revenue neutral and so forth. If it doesn't all add up, then why is he seen as the great intellectual powerhouse of the party? Surely people can see that, or is it just
Well, it's going to be an optical illusion. And, Shakespeare once said, the wish is father to the thought. And okay, well, people will believe it because they want to believe it. This happens all of the time. There are people now who will still say, well, Obama's had 3-4 years to revive the economy, but he just needs another 6 or 7 or 8 and it'll work. And so in politics, we need to remember that people will oftentimes believe things that are totally fantastical simply because the opposite looks too bleak to them.
I mean, it's interesting because he's also presented as this great model congressman, but we couldn't help but notice that only 2 of his bills have passed in 13 years in Congress. One was to rename a post office in his district, and then the other was in December 2008. He amended the excise tax on arrows, which as an archery. So those are his 2 major achievements.
Yes, and you wonder, doesn't he have more important things to devote his intellectual energy toward than this kind of trivia?
Well, some people say archery actually does help the mind, but we won't go into that.
Okay.
We won't go down that route.
Yeah.
But then, because he's being presented as this great philosophical figure then, does he truly believe in reshaping society fundamentally, as far as we can tell, Wendell Potter? Or is it just a cynical pandering to the 1% who who funds the Republican Party and himself and everything else. How do we look at that?
You know, I think there is some pandering there. I suspect, though, that when one hears that he read and was a follower of Ayn Rand, and so one would think that maybe he was inspired by her writings and that point of view.
I mean, he speaks very passionately about it.
He does indeed. So I suspect that there's probably something real there. But I think also, if you look at his background, I think he probably doesn't truly understand the needs that a lot of Americans have, and the need that they have for social programs to pull them out of poverty, and it has for many millions of Americans.
But John Nichols, help us, I mean, you know him better than most. Help us understand that cognitive dissonance between his stated adherence to Ayn Rand and the reality of his career and the positions that he's taken there.
Well, Paul Ryan is a complex guy. Let's start to unpack this with a basic concept. The Republican Party, as it exists today, remember, the Republican Party is a great political party, one of the planet's remarkable long-term political groupings. But today, the notion of being the intellectual leader of the Republican Party is not exactly one that's overplayed. In fact, the fact of the matter is the Republican Party has become more and more identified with fantastical thinking on a host of issues. Global warming, the economics, international policy, again and again and again, taking extreme positions and not always making a lot of sense. And so Ryan may well be the intellectual leader of the right wing of the Republican Party, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the greatest thinker. I don't think he's a foolish man. I don't think he's stupid. But I do think that he is very much a member of the current conservative establishment in the United States. And that is a community that celebrates great service, above all, to Wall Street, to financial services institutions, to big corporations and big banks. And it also looks at the world really as America's playground. The notion that this country can launch wars at whim and on will rather than via necessity. And so that makes him very popular with the party. But I would emphasize that if you look through Paul Ryan's record, you won't find examples of courage. You won't find examples of great intellectual adventurism. Rather, you'll find a guy who's a rather predictable mainstream Republican and mainstream conservative Republican. But that's what the party wants at this point. And unfortunately, an awful lot of the American media tends to accept the spin rather than to dig deeper and to take a serious look at the man. If you do take a serious look at the man, you will find he is a politician, not an economist.
And he's been in Washington since he was 28 years old.
Bruce,
yeah.
I'm going to correct you.
Earlier?
He came right out of college as a congressional aide. Yeah. So even longer.
So again, he's not exactly an outsider.
The insider's insider, and that also narrows the universe of his intellectual perspective.
But as you said yourself then, he probably, I mean, he doesn't necessarily have that much influence on a potential Romney presidency. Actually, Romney himself even suggested, look, I mean, there's all this fuss about the Ryan budget plan, but there's a Romney budget plan. And so, I mean, how did they differ, actually, Wendell?
Well, you know, interestingly, one of the things that Romney criticized the president for on the very day that he announced that Ryan was going to be his running mate was the fact that the Congressional Budget Office has said that the Affordable Care Act will...
Actually, we have that. We have that soundbite. Let's play that. This is what Romney had to say on this topic.
As poverty has risen to historic and tragic levels, with nearly 1 out of 6 Americans now having fallen into poverty, we will act to bring these families into the middle class. Unlike the current president who's cut Medicare funding by $700 billion, we will preserve and protect Medicare and Social Security and keep them there for future generations.
And I have a feeling you're going to drive a hole through that, Wendell.
Well,
drive through the hole. Sorry.
First of all, it's disingenuous. The $700 million or $1 billion would be savings from reduced payments to healthcare providers.
Not to the beneficiaries.
Not to the beneficiaries. There would be no benefit cuts at all. And these are reductions in payments that the healthcare providers agreed to because they understand the importance of bringing more people into coverage. And this is a way to do that. The savings will help to finance the expansion of coverage. That, interestingly, is something that Paul Ryan preserves. And it's exactly what Romney was criticizing. But in addition to handing over the Medicare program to private insurers, which of course they like, it would preserve those reductions in payments to providers.
But John, how does then the Romney budget differ from the Ryan budget? Or is it also nebulous sometimes? It's difficult to tell.
I think nebulous is the key word there. The truth of the matter is that Mitt Romney doesn't have a budget. He has a series of proposals that seems to be very, very fluid. Throughout the course of this campaign, going back to December and January when he was in the Republican primaries, he's done a sort of elaborate dance with the Ryan budget. Sometimes in his campaign advertising and his speeches, he talks about how he embraces the Ryan budget, how he likes what Paul Ryan is doing. Other times, including just yesterday, he will talk about how, no, I've got my own budget, it's a little different, I've got my own way of doing it. The fact of the matter is that Mitt Romney chose Paul Ryan as his running mate because his campaign has been so ill-defined. And he is seeking definition with the party base. He wants core Republicans to think he is a Paul Ryan man, while still trying to preserve that nebulous nature, that flexibility with the rest of America.
Which is very difficult to retain now, I suppose. And we now already see the line of attack from the Obama campaign. Here's an advert that they have produced.
I put out a very comprehensive plan rewriting the healthcare system, Medicare, Social Security, our entire tax system.
I think it'd be marvelous if the Senate were to pick up Paul Ryan's budget and to adopt it.
The Paul Ryan Medicare plan turns Medicare into a voucher system.
The Paul Ryan budget, which cuts aid to the disabled, which cuts aid to immigrants' children, which cuts aid to the elderly,
would cut Pell Grants for college students by $170 billion and cut off 1 million students over the next decade.
The cuts in here are so dramatic. They are so painful.
It gives a $4.3 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest in this country.
So if Mitt Romney became President of the United States, you're convinced he would follow through with a lot of the reductions that you make?
Yes.
I applaud it. It's an excellent piece of work and very much needed.
So, John Nichols, is there now a clear choice between Obama and Romney, or, if elected, would Romney kind of fudge some of these issues and probably continue the same sort of center-right economic model that President Obama arguably has? You know, we understand President Obama feels he doesn't get enough credit for being willing to cut Social Security and Medicare and so forth. I mean, is there a real choice now, do you think?
Well, my friend Bruce Fein will tell you that there's a very good likelihood that Mitt Romney will scramble back to the center or even to the left. Remember, Mitt Romney started out as a relatively liberal Republican not that long ago. That's the great challenge with this. The choice of Paul Ryan may be definitional. If Mitt Romney fully embraces the Paul Ryan plan, then I can tell you what will happen. The American people will reject this ticket, and they might well vote for Democrats down ballot and make this a very, very good year for the Democratic Party.
But I can guarantee you, if I could interrupt, John, presidents, as you well know, they don't like to give credit to their running mates. No. Every president has egos. And I can guarantee you, Romney is not going to say, I'm a carbon copy of Paul Ryan. It diminishes him. And he isn't running for politically. He's not running for president because he's got a small ego. So in my judgment, this is vastly inflated as to how much it will influence Mitt Romney. I mean, I've been in here, Washington, for myself 40-some years, and every president comes in and says, I'm doing something different than anybody else. That's their legacy. That's why they're running for office. And that's why I think all the suggestion that he's going to be borrowing a carbon copy out of Paul Ryan's budget, I think, is nonsense.
Wendell Potter, final thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with that to a certain extent, but I think that the media and the Democrats will not let people forget about the Ryan budget. I think it will come to define the campaign.
Wendell Potter, John Nichols, Bruce Fein, thank you all very much. And that's
Thank
all
you.
from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.